Hey there, Epistemic Anthony here. Just wanted to respond to a Mr. Jeremiah Knight on Twitter. I saw this post of his. The church today desperately needs a more robust understanding of the sufficiency of Scripture. Now, that word sufficiency, that's a powerful word. What does that mean, though? Because on one hand, something could be sufficient if it is all you need, right? So, uh, water is sufficient for hydration. See, Um, but something can also be sufficient if it is good enough for a task, right? So it is of high enough quality to meet a task. So I can say, oh, I don't know, Gatorade is sufficient for hydration, right? Or something. Maybe that's not a good example. Snap-on mechanics tools are sufficient for working on cars. That's a good one. Uh, Snap-on tools are sufficient. What does that mean? It means Snap-on tools are of high enough quality for the task of working on a car, right? It doesn't mean that all I need is a Snap-on tool and I can fix any problem with the car. Obviously, I need parts. I need my hands, my labor, right? It's not just the Snap-on tool. It's not the only thing needed. Um, so we have to decide then, okay, how do we justify the reformed doctrine of the sufficiency of Scripture? Because I'm sorry to say, and Mr. Knight, you know, I'm saying this with sincerity. There's nothing in Scripture that says Scripture is all you need. That's just not in there. The word sufficient is in there, but as we just talked about, sufficient has two definitions at minimum. You can't just pick one definition and say, oh, that's what it means. You don't have any credibility to make that judgment to say authoritatively that's what it means. Um, and historically, that's not how it was taken. It was taken to mean it's good enough for the task of teaching, meaning if I want to teach someone, scripture is good enough for me to do that. That's why most translations, what is that? What is that verse? Hold on. Just going to look up the verse that talks about the sufficiency. Second Timothy 3:16 through 17. Most translations of that verse actually say Scripture is useful for that. It doesn't say Scripture is all that's needed, right? And that's because the Greek word there doesn't mean it's all that's needed. It means useful, sufficient in that sense, right? So let's just follow this logic through though. How could Scripture ever be sufficient in the Reformed sense? Well, Scripture didn't fall out of the sky uh, in a vacuum, right? Jesus didn't ascend into the clouds and then the Bible came down after him. His apostles had oral teaching and they passed on the oral teaching and sometimes they wrote their teachings down. So they had oral and written teaching. And in Second Thessalonians 2:15, again, let's see if we want to talk about the sufficiency of Scripture, let's see what Scripture says about itself, right? Second Thessalonians 2:15, the apostle Paul tells the Thessalonians to follow the traditions that he passed on to them, whether by word or by written epistle. By word or by written epistle. Okay. So we have spoken teaching from Paul and we have written teaching from Paul. And Paul says, follow what I taught you, whether it's by written or by spoken word. He didn't say, oh, hey, ignore everything else other than what I've written. He never said that. Further, on a practical level, we don't have access, me as a 21st century man, I don't have access to the writings of Paul, right? Uh, Romans is attributed to Paul, right? Generally speaking. Um, but there is the possibility that Romans just was never written by Paul or whatever. I have to trust the testimony of the early church to tell me that Romans was actually written by Paul. I don't have the actual letter that Paul wrote, right? Um, so I can't go by just what Paul wrote because I don't have access to that directly. Now, I can say, oh, Romans was written by Paul, but how do I know that? I know that because of the testimony of the earliest Christians. That is called tradition, right? The testimony of the earliest Christians is called tradition. When you take away the reliability of tradition or you no longer trust tradition, then you can't give an account. You can't give a robust account of anything about Scripture at all. That is why when Martin Luther threw out tradition, he instantly had the opportunity to also throw out James. He doubted the authenticity of Revelations, Hebrews, Jude, um, because, like it or not, the scriptures didn't come out of the sky on their own. The bedrock of scripture is tradition. That is how we know that Romans was written by Romans, that Romans was written by Paul, that Matthew was written by Matthew. Matthew never even says who its author is, right? Matthew doesn't say that. That's tradition that tells us that. Um, you can go down the list, and we can't just say, oh, well, this book says it's written by Paul. No, that's not good enough. There are plenty of books from that time that were fraudulent. They were fraudulently written. And it took work and debate for the early church to figure out which books were actually written by the apostles, right? And they did that on the basis of, well, we've been using this book, James, for hundreds of years in our liturgy. In our liturgy, they had liturgical worship they used to decide which books were authentic or not. The evangelical scholar F.F. Brute notes this in his book, that the liturgy was essential for forming the canon of Scripture. Not because the declaration of the church turned a non-canon book into a canon one, or because the church had some sort of authority to make books inspired. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the books were always inspired. They were always written by the apostles. But I don't have those books, right? What I have are books that the early church tells me and decided they identified them. Identified is a good word. They identified these books as the authentic ones, right? That were really written by Paul, that were really written by James, Matthew, Mark, etc., right? Without trusting that reliable authority, right? That reliable tradition, the reliable testimony of the early church, we don't have a canon of Scripture at all. So before we can have any robust understanding of what the sufficiency of Scripture means, we have to understand that if Scripture, we can't divorce Scripture from the reality of how it was formed. Okay, and Scripture does not contain the tools within itself to tell me of its own authenticity. Okay, there is no self-evident canon. There was much debate. There were only two early church writers. That was Saint Jerome and Saint Augustine, or Saint Augustine, who had the Protestant 66 book canon, right? Many other writers had different canons. They had the deuterocanonical books in there, Maccabees, Sirach, Baruch, all that kind of stuff. John Calvin thought Baruch was scripture. So what you see throughout the history of the church is not any testimony of a self-evident canon that verifies itself, right? What you see is people debating and having many different canons and many different lists of books, and denying the authenticity of this book and choosing the authenticity of this book, or saying that this book is authentic and this book isn't, and other people saying no, that's not authentic and this one is, and having debate. Virtually no one recognized the canonicity or the authenticity of the book of Revelation, right? The church definitely decided that. Now, the question the Protestant has to ask themselves is, did the church have the authority to establish a set canon for the church? Does any leader have that kind of authority today? Many Protestants will say no. Your church does not have the authority to tell you which books you are allowed to consider to be scripture or not. And if that's the case, then the ancient church also had no authority to do that. And that means that I can choose personally, from my own conviction, whatever Bible I want. I think Maccabees is scripture, right? I think Sirach is scripture. I think Baruch is scripture. Maybe James isn't scripture. Maybe Martin Luther was fine to throw out James. That's a problem that the Protestants have to address. And you can't address it by appealing to a sufficiency of scripture, because scripture doesn't contain the tools to do this. So, all right. I hope and look forward to a response. Thank you.